Welcome, everybody, to the February Walk Massachusetts Network meeting. I'm going to turn it over now to our speaker, Stephanie Grady. Stephanie, on to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brendan, and thank you so much, everyone, for this wonderful opportunity to present to the Walk Massachusetts Network on what I'm doing at the BU School of Public Health on the impacts of transportation noise and the environment on aging populations. So as Brendan had mentioned, my name is Stephanie, and I'm a fifth-year doctoral student in the Department of Environmental Health, as well as a new board member with Walk Massachusetts. And so a little bit about me. So I've grown up moving from city to city and state to state throughout my life. But I actually ended up at Texas A&M in 2006 and earned a degree, bachelor's degree in biology in 2010. I have slowly made my way up the East Coast. I then traveled to New York City, in which I earned my degree in the Master's in Public Health and Epidemiology, which is the study of diseases and patterns of disease over time at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. And then from there, I moved up to Boston, in which I worked at the Department of Veteran Affairs, the Brigham and Women's Hospital, and Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health on a really cool study looking at the indoor and outdoor pollution and the effects on pulmonary health in veterans with COPD. And so I worked mostly at the VA, and so which is pictured here in Jamaica Plain. And I have a very soft spot in my heart for the VA, as I learned so much about research, public health, and veteran health through that experience. And so after 7 years, I decided to go back to school, which landed me at BU, in which I've been working over the past 4.5, 5 years, looking at how noise influences heart and brain health. And so, oh no, this is not. And so what really brings me to public health, in particular environmental health, was my own personal experiences with stress, heart disease, and overall chronic conditions. And so personally, I've struggled with mental health conditions throughout my life, and very close members of my family have also had problems with cardiovascular disease since I was 13. And so really understanding what contributes to stress and heart disease and age-related diseases is something that I really care about. And something that really stuck with me, about 15 years ago, was how the influence of our neighborhoods and built environment really can affect our health, and how we have that ability to change our environments to make it easier to live happier and healthy lives. And additionally, a perk about working in public health in neighborhood and built environment issues is it's a great way to intervene at the population level, whether it be through policy or working directly with communities. And so when I first joined BU, I was introduced to the world of noise pollution and how it can affect our health. And you may be thinking, as well as I thought when I first started, is, like, what do you mean by noise? How is that different than sound? Isn't that subjective? Doesn't it differ between people? And, yes, it does. Like, noise is a term that is subjectively given, but it's much more, much more than that. And so, when we talk about sound, this represents, the physical pressure waves or vibrations that, you hear and that are perceived by the brain. But noise really represents the complex pattern of sound that can be actually unwanted or harmful. And so we could think about this in the terms of going to a concert, like it's a concert for, a musician that you really like, that's definitely wanted sound, but, at really high intensity levels, that still can be harmful. And so when I talk about noise, transportation or environmental noise today, I'm going to interchange noise and sound, as like transportation noise really means any sound emitted from aircraft, railway, or automobile vehicles. And with this, there actually has been a rising concern about transportation noise levels, given the demand for aviation and travel. Also, with things like Amazon and home delivery services, we're actually seeing an increase in, more like uh, employments and things like that when it comes to deliveries, even though technically some of our aircraft and our machinery have gotten quieter. Um, Yet there really has been little published in the United States on the health effects of noise. Most of the literature looking at health effects of noise has been done in Europe. And that's not to say that, the mechanisms in which noise leads to adverse health outcomes differ by country, but it's more to say that the policy here in the US is really based on research done in US populations. And so having research done like at the US level is very important. And so when I talk about how to measure noise, I'm really referring to noise intensity or loudness. And there are many properties of noise that I'm not going to talk about today that are important, so like frequency or tone. Um, but as I'm sure everyone knows, when we measure intensity of noise, we're using something called the decibel scale, which is a little different than how we measure other environmental pollutants such as air pollution, like particulate matter or heat, in that what we're using is actually a logarithmic scale. And that really accounts for the very wide range of sounds that we could hear. And so when we really talk about like a 10 decibel change, so going from like a 30 decibel to a 40 decibel change, that translate into something that is twice as loud. Um, and so that's been something that I know that I've been struggling with is like, how do you interpret, some of the findings given that, we are looking at a log scale versus something that's a little bit easier to interpret, when it comes to like heat or air pollution. And so to give you just like a very brief like sense of reference, like a conversation that we're having now is probably about 65 decibels. City traffic is about 78. A rock concert's 105. And then if you were standing underneath, a jet as it was taking off, hopefully you would have hearing protection. That would be at 140 decibels. And so the way that we look at environmental noise in public health is using a metric called the day-night average sound level. And so this really represents a cumulative exposure to sound on an average day. And so this is not really a perfect measure. It shouldn't be used as the one and only way to look at noise, but it does do a good job of representing noise on an average day. And so the interesting thing about DNL is that it gives an additional weighting for nighttime noise. So it adds a 10 decibel penalty for noise that happens between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. And so like in this graph to show you what that looks like, we have here on a 24-hour time period, if you measure like the sound level every hour, um, you could create like you can create a weighted average of how much sound you're exposed to in a day. And so for the nighttime noise here in dark blue, it just adds an extra 10 decibel penalty, given that, our ears are usually more sensitive at nighttime. That's the time when most people sleep. And then that's also the time when there is usually less traffic. And so, what a lot of agencies do, particularly the Federal Aviation Administration or the FAA, is they use DNL as its regulatory metric when assessing aircraft noise. And so, when it comes to regulations, it's mostly when it comes to noise abatement in areas that surround airports or are under aircraft flight paths. However, as I mentioned previously, this measure is definitely not perfect. So, FAA uses a DNL threshold of 65 decibels for noise abatement. Yet, this one number doesn't necessarily tell the whole story of how noise can affect health. So, for example, you could be exposed to one really loud event that, ends up being 65 decibels, or it could be, 10 a little bit smaller events, or it could be actually 100 events. And so the issue with the DNL metric is that it kind of glosses over the frequency of these events happening over a single day or a year. And this can actually be very problematic to people who are living under flight paths, in that, the differences in the intermittency of like these events can really be a problem. It can be really annoying too. And when we talk about annoyance, that's actually how most of the noise policies were initially um, started here in the US. Is that studies over the past 50 years have looked a lot about the different sources of noise in relation to residential annoyance. And many of these studies actually have come to the same conclusions, that even at the same intensity level, so the same noise, like loudness, people will perceive aircraft versus road traffic versus railway noise um, in different ways, even though they are the same noise level. And so the scary thing is, actually, this is a little bit outdated now. So this was, adapted from 2001, but we're actually seeing shifts more to the left, meaning that people are becoming more annoyed or having more noise sensitivity at lower levels. And so this is really creating a problem for people living, near aircraft flight paths, near roadways, near railways. But noise is more than just annoyance. And so I could go on a whole spiel about what we talk about when we mean annoyance and how annoyance is perceived in society. But that I know is like for another time. Um, but for here, what I wanted to show is that noise actually can cause different types of stress responses, which has been theorized that the major pathways that noise affects health is, yes, through annoyance and physiological stress, but also through sleep disruption and I said psychological stress and physiological stress. So basically, inflammation and oxidative stress responses within the body. So basically, what happens is when sound travels through your ears, it initiates this neurological and hormonal response that travels through your brain and through the rest of your body. And this has led to a lot of research that have found associations between noise and health, like different health outcomes. So, there are a lot of noise, there are a lot of studies that have been done in children. There is a very pivotal study that was done in New York City by Dr. Arlene Bronzaft, where she was looking at a school in, I think, the Bronx, and she found that, students that were conducting or that were being tested on one side of the building next to an elevated platform were actually performing a lot worse than students on the other side, which was a quieter side of the school. And so that has really led to a lot of other studies that have been conducted on cognitive development in children. There's also been studies looking at psychological triggers for individuals with PTSD. Also sleep disturbance is a big one. Increased heart rate, changes in the immune system, anxiety, elevated cortisol production, which leads to stress, prolonged periods of stress, hypertension, heart attacks, vasoconstriction, elevated blood pressure, elevated adrenal levels, and so much more than what's listed here. And so, you know, many European countries have really been ahead of the game in looking at the health effects of noise, in which they've been able to conduct health impact assessments to really understand the number of people that are affected. And in 2018, the WHO for the European region actually released a report in which they were able to gather and review the literature on the health impacts of noise and provide guidance on how to protect the public. And so in this report, they made many recommendations in where they believe that they found sufficient evidence to say that there were effects of noise above certain thresholds. And that depended on the noise source and then also the time of day or the time period. So again, we have DNL, which is that average day noise level, which accounts for, giving higher weights to nighttime noise as well as nighttime noise in particular. And so for road traffic, they were able to come up with an agreement that, health effects, or in order for health, like for the what they found for health effects were above 53 and 45 decibels. So they recommended, places put in policy and regulation to reduce road noise at certain times of the day to these levels, to at most these levels. For railway noise at or under 54 decibels or 44 decibels for nighttime noise, and then aircraft 45 and 40 decibels. And the thing is, I don't think any of our communities are reaching these thresholds, are less than these thresholds. Like I think that most of our communities are actually higher than these thresholds. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done, both worldwide and then in the US, on how to reduce these levels. And a lot of different people from different industries and different fields are working together to try to make road noise, rail, and aircraft quieter, whether it be from the actual source, so at cars, aircraft, and trains, or finding ways to mitigate the noise by including barriers or through policy. And so you might be asking, are there regulations here in the US? If there, are regulations that are starting to happen over in Europe? And given that, we do have regulations for some, not all air pollutants here in the US, what about noise? And as you probably have guessed, the answer is no. But the thing is, we actually have known that has been a pollutant for many, many years. Actually, in the 1970s, the EPA actually established the Office of Noise Abatement and Control under Richard Nixon, in which a lot of the work on noise in the US was actually done. So they established a number of acts that got the ball rolling on acknowledging noise as a pollutant by funding research to do noise in different communities, um, and then also providing funding and foundations for our noise abatement and measures that we use today. Unfortunately, in 1982, under Ronald Reagan, the Office of Noise Abatement and Control was defunded. Thus, that left the federal government powerless in doing any meaningful work. And so, after that very short decades worth of work, the drive to do work on noise pollution has really been limited, given the lack of funding, and then also, just because there's like that lack of funding, lack of research, and attention. So a lot of current initiatives we have on noise are really based on information that we gathered in the 1970s, which is, over almost half a century ago. And, over the past few years, though, Congress has actually started to pay attention to noise, in which they want to update the resource. And my hope is that it will contribute to more relevant noise policy and maybe noise regulation. So it's starting to reemerge, the interest in noise and understanding that noise is a problem for communities, which is a step in the right direction. And so this is what really kickstarted our work at BU, looking at the health effects of noise. And so, what we're doing is collaborating with different government agencies and academic institutions on how to investigate these effects. And so to do this, we've leveraged, national environmental data from the FAA, as well as from Volpe transportation systems at the DOT, as well as different research study cohort data. And so this cohort data is really important for public health research in that you actually get a number of people who agree to participate in these studies, and then they're followed up for a period of time, and in some cases, this turns into decades. And so what we have on these individuals is really detailed information on their health, their behaviors, environmental factors, in which a lot of their health outcomes are reviewed by, physicians. And so we have a lot of um, sensitivity and specificity when it comes to if someone actually has a health condition or not. And with environmental health work, a lot of the environmental exposures are tied to residential addresses, in which we're able to geocode and track over time. And so, a few things that we're doing at BU is to really, characterize aircraft, road traffic, and community noise, as well as relationships with other environmental pollutants like air pollution, heat, and socioeconomic status from the available data that we can find publicly, as well as from our collaborations with, again, government institutions and other academic institutions. And so what we have right now are estimates for aircraft noise. We have some estimates for road traffic noise. We actually have collaborators at University of Michigan who have conducted noise sampling campaigns in Chicago, and we were actually able to estimate community noise, which is supposed to encapsulate both aircraft, road traffic, and any kind of noise that has happened, within that time span. In addition to all the geospatial data on air pollution from satellites, heat, and then, and very importantly, socioeconomic status. So how resourced are these communities is very important to what we're looking at. We're also looking at relationships with noise and sleep, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, mental health outcomes, cognition, and something that I've been recently doing and is part of my dissertation work is actually looking at Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, as it actually, we're finding some, previous studies have found, especially in our Chicago cohort, relationships between community noise, cognition, and Alzheimer's disease diagnoses. And so an example of one of the major cohorts that we're working with is the Nurses' Health Studies, which really consists of a large nationwide cohort of female nurses that were recruited in the 1970s and followed up through today through the Brigham and Women's Hospital, Harvard Medical School, and Harvard School of Public Health. And so investigators within the Nurses' Health Study actually have started these other spin-off cohorts, which have gained a lot of traction over time, which includes Nurses Health Study 2, which is a group of younger nurses that were recruited in 1989, the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, which includes health professionals that are mostly men that were recruited in 1989, the Growing Up Today study, which are actually children of women that were in the Nurses 2 study. And then also Nurses 3, which I have a link right here, which are actively recruiting nurses and nursing students of all genders to participate in the study. And so with this data from, people in our communities in the US, it really has helped shape a lot of policy and a lot of work in public health, not only in the environmental field, but also looking at risk factors for cardiovascular disease, looking at oral contraception. A lot of different public health initiatives have really spun out of the Nurses' Health Studies, which has been pretty amazing to be a part of. And so what we're doing within the Nurses' Health Study is linking environmental noise with health, so particularly cardiovascular disease, sleep, diabetes, and mental health outcomes. And so, sorry. And so one of our studies, which we actually published last year, looked at relationships between aircraft noise levels and sleep, in which participants were asked how many hours do they sleep at night, and we looked at the links between their residential aircraft noise exposure, and the number of hours that they reported. And what we found was actually that those that were living in areas where they were exposed to more noise actually reported sleeping fewer hours. And so this is only a starting point in what we're actually trying to look at and build this body of evidence so that we can give to policymakers to make decisions to change um, the current policies and regulations, and hopefully, you know, start refunding the Office of Noise Control and Abatement, because noise is an issue. Similarly, our colleagues at Harvard look at environmental noise using a different prediction model. So they were looking at ambient outdoor noise. So this model was done by the National Park Service, in which it measures, natural noise. It does measure traffic noise, so cars, rail, um, aircraft noise, any sort of community noise, and they linked that to cardiovascular disease incidents. So whether someone had a heart attack or if they had a stroke. And so what they found is they actually found increased risk of cardiovascular disease with higher levels of ambient noise. And this is in the same cohort that we conducted our sleep study in. And this is something that we're still continuing to gather information on. So we're looking at, you know, aircraft noise in particular. Is aircraft noise related to increased cardiovascular disease? Or, maybe, if it isn't, then maybe is it road traffic? Is it some other source that, we need to be paying attention to? We're also looking at things like diabetes, because that's also a very important factor to look at, as well as mental health outcomes. And so, we're continuing to gather this information, looking at different effects. Um, but again, one or two studies is not enough to build policy around it, particularly since we have a lot of challenges to the studies that we conduct. And so, not only are there costs and logistics of studies that are sometimes a barrier to, collecting good, valid information, but additionally, there are variations, in the geographic space and time in which we're collecting this data. So, we're collecting data for only a certain time period and a certain group of people, which are nurses or healthcare professionals. And the reason why we did that is because the investigators at the time believed that, when it comes to like recalling certain, conditions that they had, they would be more likely to recall those events given that they're in that field. But, that may not be representative of everyone in the United States. Another issue with the nurses' health study is it's predominantly white. And so we're really missing an opportunity to look at the entire US, particularly at, marginalized communities in which, we hypothesize that, like these environmental injustices when it comes to noise pollution, in addition to water pollution, air pollution, under resources, like these effects could actually be greater. And so, in additional to those issues, there's also complex interactions with other pollutants. And so, we don't live in a vacuum where we're only exposed to noise. We're exposed to a lot of other pollutants. So air pollution, again, climate change, heat, extreme weather events, like all these things play a factor, and interact with things like noise. And then lastly, the perception of experiences. So the issue that we struggle with these large cohort studies is, a lot of times we don't actually collect what people think of their experiences. We don't really, conduct these studies with community participants. We conduct it on participants. So we're here sitting at our ivory towers and not really including the people who are actually being the most affected. And so that is something that we have struggled with, and something that we need to fix as academia, multiple academic institutions. And so, even though there's a lot of work to be done in all these areas, we're starting to see some baby steps towards the right direction. So with the introduction of the smartphone, you know, a lot of people have and companies have been able to release publicly available smartphone apps to measure sound levels in communities. And at Brown University, Dr. Erica Walker is conducting a lot of work with residents in New England as well as folks in Mississippi on community participatory research looking at environmental health and injustice issues to give them the power to speak up for their communities to policymakers and also be aware of the noise levels that are in their communities. And so, as part of the Walk Massachusetts network, I was hoping to sort of, facilitate a discussion and also answer some questions that you have for me. But, as a true believer that in order to help public health move forward, we really need to work across silos and have a range of different voices and opinions to really have sustainable solutions. And so, I would be really happy to hear how noise has affected you all and your communities, as well as ideas of how, we can work together across different disciplines, fields, agencies, organizations, with our own lived experiences and own expertise to reduce the health hazards and inequities in noise pollution, as well as, walkability and climate change and all the things that are affecting us that are very much entwined. And so with this, I mean, I just want to thank you all so much for your time, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to discussing more with you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Stephanie. I'm going to stop the recording.